I've spoken many times about challenges, setbacks, and risks, but there's something I've rarely admitted out loud. I had an addiction, not to alcohol, not to drugs, not to smoking or gambling. My addiction was something far more subtle, more insidious, and for a long time I convinced myself it was harmless, even noble, but the truth is, it almost ruined everything that mattered to me. And before I get deeper into this, I want to ask you something because maybe this isn't just my story. Have you ever had something in your life that felt productive, even admirable, but slowly began to consume you? Was it work, success, the need to constantly check your phone? Leave a comment because I am genuinely curious how many of us are fighting addictions that society doesn't even call addictions. For me, it began with a simple belief. If I just worked harder, longer, smarter than anyone else, I could achieve things no one thought possible. And at first, it worked. Companies grew, rockets flew, cars changed the industry, ideas turned into realities. On the outside, it looked like relentless determination. On the inside, it was something darker. I couldn't stop. I didn't know how to stop. Work became oxygen. If I wasn't answering emails at 3 a.m., sketching designs on napkins during meals, or reviewing code between meetings, I felt like I was failing. I convinced myself this was necessary, that greatness required sacrifice. But what I didn't realize at the time was that sacrifice had no boundaries once you allow obsession to control you. Slowly, I noticed the toll. Meals went untouched. Conversations with family became background noise. My children would ask me a question and I'd nod while my mind was still orbiting Mars. Friends stopped calling because they knew I'd cancel anyway. Sleep turned into a rare luxury, and when it did come, it was restless, filled with equations, deadlines, and unfinished plans. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, it was destructive, and the worst part, I didn't even see it as a problem. Society rewarded me for it. Headlines called me unstoppable. Interviews praised my work ethic. Investors celebrated my intensity. But behind the applause, I was breaking slowly, invisibly, and dangerously. What makes this kind of addiction so dangerous is that it hides behind admiration. Nobody warns you that success itself can be toxic when consumed without balance. Nobody tells you that productivity can turn into poison. And nobody tells you that the same thing that makes you exceptional in one area can quietly destroy every other area of your life. I'm not proud of how long it took me to see the truth. I ignored red flags for years, pretending that exhaustion was just part of the journey, pretending that loneliness was just the price of ambition, pretending that missing out on moments with loved ones was temporary, something I could fix later, but later never comes. That's the trap. Looking back, I realized that what I called dedication was in reality dependency. I wasn't choosing to work, I needed to work. I wasn't controlling the mission was controlling me, and as strange as it sounds, that's the real definition of addiction. When something you think you control actually controls you. When I finally allow myself to revisit those years, it almost feels like I'm looking at someone else's life. On the surface, it was a golden era. Tesla was scaling, SpaceX was making history, new ideas were being born faster than anyone could keep track of. But behind that curtain of success was a man who was constantly running on fumes. I remember nights when I would walk into the factory at midnight, not to check on progress, but because I simply didn't know what else to do with myself. The silence of the production line, the hum of the machines, it felt more like home than my own house. My addiction to work had reached the point where normal life felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. Sitting at a dinner table with my kids and trying to have a normal conversation felt more exhausting than running through engineering schematics for 6 hours straight. That's when I should have realized something was wrong, but I didn't. I pushed harder. I convinced myself that I was building the future and that every sacrifice was justified. Yet the sacrifices never ended. Birthdays blurred into board meetings. Weekends didn't exist. Vacations were a myth, and every time someone I cared about tried to tell me to slow down, I brushed them off with the same excuse. I don't have a choice. The truth is, I did have a choice. I just didn't want to face it, because to slow down meant confronting the emptiness that came when the work stopped. It meant facing myself, and in those days I wasn't sure I liked the version of myself that wasn't working. Physically, the toll was obvious. My sleep dropped to just a few hours a night. I would go entire days forgetting to eat, living off coffee and adrenaline. There were moments I literally collapsed at my desk, waking up to find my team looking at me with worry in their eyes. But I shrugged it off. I'm fine, I'd say, even as my hands shook from exhaustion. Mentally, the toll was even heavier. I became impatient, irritable, unable to truly listen. Conversations with friends felt like distractions. Time with family felt like interruptions, and slowly people around me started to drift away. Some stopped calling, others stopped waiting. I didn't lose them all at once. It happened gradually, quietly, until one day I realized how small my circle had become. What addiction steals most ruthlessly is presence. You may be physically there, but your mind is somewhere else. I was in the same room as my children, but I wasn't with them. I nodded at their stories without hearing a word. I looked at their drawings without really seeing them. And one day, one of my kids asked me a question that pierced me in a way I'll never forget. Dad, are you always going to be busy? I laughed it off at the time, but later, alone, that question echoed in my head like a warning bell because deep down I knew the answer. Yes, unless something changed, I was always going to be busy. Too busy to show up, too busy to listen, too busy to be human. And here's the dangerous part. The world rewarded me for this behavior. Investors praised the long hours. The media loved the relentless work ethic narrative. Society glamorized the grind. Every time I pushed myself past exhaustion, it wasn't seen as unhealthy. It was seen as heroic. But behind that facade, I was deteriorating. I began to notice small cracks. I would forget conversations minutes after having them. I struggled to sleep even when I had the time. My emotions became unpredictable, frustration boiling over at the smallest setbacks. The people closest to me bore the weight of it all. And the irony is that while I was building rockets to reach Mars, I was failing at the one mission that truly mattered, building a life worth living here on Earth. Looking back now, I can see how clear the warning signs were. Addiction doesn't always announce itself with chaos and destruction. Sometimes it hides behind success, achievement, and applause. But no matter how well disguised, it eats away at the foundations of your life until everything you've built is at risk of collapse. The moment that changed everything didn't come with a bang. It didn't arrive as a headline, a boardroom showdown, or a dramatic collapse. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday in the shape of a person who had known me long before any of the companies, the launches, or the articles. My oldest friend. He walked into my office unannounced because he was worried. That worry turned out to be the single most important intervention of my life. He didn't knock. He simply stepped into the open plan space where I lived at my desk, stacks of papers, 3 screens glowing with code, a coffee cup that had long gone cold. I was in the middle of toggling between 3 video calls and an urgent engineering thread. To everyone else, I probably looked normal, focused, decisive, competent. To him, I looked hollow, not busy in the way productive people are busy, but busy to avoid something else. He watched for a minute, then walked over, put a hand flat on my keyboard, closed the laptop, and said quietly, "Elon, you need to leave right now." It was neither an order nor a suggestion. It was a line in the sand. I tried to joke, "Can't Falcon status just changed?" But he didn't smile. "You're not listening," he said. "You're not living. Come on." That insistence felt invasive at first. My immediate reaction was irritation. Who is he to tell me to step away when schedules and millions of people's livelihoods depended on momentum? Then I saw his face, calm, steady, the expression of someone who'd watched me erode for months. This wasn't a dramatic lecture. It was a rescue. We walked out together into the afternoon air, and he led me to a small, quiet cafe 3 blocks away. Nothing fancy, just a place with low light, the smell of real coffee, and a few wooden tables. The kind of place where people slow down. He sat me down in a corner booth and ordered 2 coffees. He didn't start with platitudes. He asked small questions. When was the last time you had a real conversation with your kids? When did you last sleep through the night? What are you building your life for, Elon? At first I deflected because deflection was my muscle memory. I said the lines I'd built my identity on. The future needed sacrifice. The mission justified the means. Progress demanded obsession. He listened without interruption and then told me a short personal story. My youngest, he said, asked me last week if the world would still be nice when he grows up. I told him I hoped so. Then he asked, "Will you be around to see it, Dad?" I had to look at him and say, "I hope so," and I realized I actually didn't know. He didn't say this to shame me. He said it to reflect a mirror. In that mirror, I saw the man who could recite launch windows and production forecasts from memory, but could no longer remember the last bedtime story he'd read to his child. I saw someone for whom later had become an indefinite promise that never arrived. Then my friend did something simple and terrifying. He put my phone face down on the table and slid it to the middle between us. 1 hour, he said. No work, no calls, no messages. Leave it here. My hands wanted to grab it reflexively. My mind started a spiral. What if something critical happened? I felt that adrenaline spike everyone knows in the back of their throat. He looked at me and said calmly, "If the world collapses without you for 1 hour, it probably doesn't need you the way you think it does." I left the phone. I breathed. I tasted the coffee, real, slightly bitter, complex. For the first time in months, I felt the world at a human scale rather than a spreadsheet. We didn't talk about KPIs. We talked about his daughter's insistence on climbing trees, about a neighbor who'd adopted an abandoned dog, about how joy could be ridiculously small and hard to notice if you're not looking. He asked me what I missed most. For a long time I couldn't answer. My brain had been so trained to inventory problems that it had forgotten to inventory pleasures. At some point, he reached across the table and said, "I know what you've built, I know what you can build, but I also know there's a man in there who likes pancakes, who gets silly with his kids, who once painted a terrible picture and was proud of it. That man matters too." That line landed. It was a grief and a release at once. He didn't propose a grand plan on that day. Instead, he made me a promise and made me make one to him. He promised he would check in not to micromanage, but to hold me accountable on the human things. In return, I promised I'd try small experiments. No phones at dinner. One day each weekend completely offline. A bedtime ritual that didn't involve emails. The commitments sounded trivial, but in my life they were revolutionary. Getting back on track wasn't a single act. It was iterative, fragile, and humiliating. The first week I slipped. I was back in the factory at midnight within 3 days. He called me and asked how dinner had gone. I said I'd had noodles at my desk. He booked a table for me and my kids and insisted I be there. He showed up in the lobby with tickets for the weekend. He wouldn't take no for an answer. He did these small acts of insistence over and over, showing up when I was too proud or too busy to show up for myself. He also pushed me to structure the change. We started with tiny, measurable habits. I delegated more decisions and I scheduled unavailable blocks in my calendar, sacred, non-negotiable family time. I started journaling for 5 minutes every morning, not to plan but to reflect on what I wanted to be present for that day. He introduced me to disconnect practices, real sleep hygiene, and enforced no email window at night and one phone-free meal a day. We experimented with meditation for 10 minutes every morning. I would have scoffed before, but after a week, I noticed a quieter mind. There were harder things too. I had to admit to my team that I needed help. I had to hire leaders I could trust and actually let them lead. Delegation is terrifying for someone whose identity is wrapped up in execution. But letting go, I discovered, expanded my capacity. The company continued and in many respects improved because people around me were empowered to make decisions. My friend didn't demand perfection, he demanded consistency. Perhaps the most crucial and painful step was relearning presence. The first real test came on a Saturday morning when my son ran into my bedroom excited to show me a drawing. Old me would have asked him to come back in 5, new me, awkward and unfamiliar with not doing work on a weekend, sat up, put the laptop aside, and asked him to explain every line. I listened. I laughed. My son didn't ask, "Are you always going to be busy that morning?" He just handed me the drawing like it was the most important thing in the world, because at that moment it was. It wasn't instant redemption. There were relapses. There were nights the inbox won. There were times I'd resent the small unproductive pauses as extravagances I couldn't afford. Each time I slipped, my friend called, sometimes gently, sometimes bluntly, and asked if I'd honored my promise to the people who mattered most. Those calls became a lifeline, an external constraint that kept the cascade from rolling back to its previous destructive momentum. Months later, the changes had compounded. My sleep improved. The edges of my irritability softened. My relationships began to repair, not overnight but gradually. A shared dinner here, a weekend trip there, a birthday remembered without an apology attached. At work, the culture shifted too. When senior leaders model taking boundaries seriously, it cascades. People felt permission to step away, to recharge. That translated into better decisions, less burnout, and ironically, more sustained productivity. Friendship was the practical mechanism that changed my life. It was not therapy in the clinical sense alone, though I did pursue professional support later. It was the unglamorous, persistent attention of someone who refused to let me excuse myself away from my own life. He didn't fix me in one conversation. He helped me build scaffolding, so I could rebuild myself. I still wake up with the old impulses, the itch to check metrics at 4 a.m., the compulsion to fix everything right now. But now I have rituals, accountability, people who will pull me out of the orbit of urgency, and most importantly, I have a clearer definition of what success actually means, not just how many milestones are checked off, but how many small human moments I'm present for. If my friend hadn't come that day, I might have kept convincing myself that obsession was virtue until something irreversible happened. Instead, he helped me remember that the point of building a future is to be alive in it, not to miss it. There's a moment that comes after the dust begins to settle, when the noise finally quiets and you're left alone with the truth. For me, that truth was brutal. If I hadn't listened to my friend that day, I might not be here to tell the story at all. I don't mean that in a metaphorical, exaggerated sense. I mean it literally. The way I was living, the endless nights, the relentless stress, the blind pursuit of progress at the cost of my body and mind, it was unsustainable. My doctors had warned me before, gently at first, then more firmly. They said the lack of rest, the constant adrenaline, and the pressure I carried were a recipe for collapse. But I had always brushed it off. I thought, I'm strong enough, I can handle this. I'll slow down later. Later never came. Looking back now, I see how close I was to burning out completely. To the kind of irreversible damage you can't fix with a few days of rest or a vacation. My heart was racing constantly, my thoughts never slowed, and my body was surviving on caffeine and sheer stubbornness. I had normalized pain, normalized exhaustion, normalized a version of life where you never stop because stopping feels like failure. And yet, that was the exact lie that almost cost me everything, because what is the point of building rockets to Mars if you don't live long enough to see one launch? What's the point of revolutionizing industries if the person leading them collapses before the dream is realized? What's the point of creating a future if you're not there to experience it? If I hadn't listened, if I had kept grinding through every red flag, every warning, every signal my body tried to give me, I could have easily ended up as another story of brilliance cut short by burnout. And the truth is, the world is full of people on that same edge right now. People convincing themselves they'll slow down later, people ignoring the warning signs because they've been taught that exhaustion is noble, that collapse is proof of commitment, but exhaustion isn't noble, collapse isn't commitment, they're warnings, their life's way of saying you can't keep going like this and expect to survive. The irony is, I thought I was indispensable, that the work couldn't happen without me, but the companies kept moving forward when I stepped back. The world didn't fall apart because I took a breath. What almost fell apart was me, and that's the lesson I carry with me now, and the one I want to pass on. No dream, no mission, no goal is worth dying for before you've had the chance to live. Because in the end, it's not just about how far you go, but whether you're still alive when you get there. Share this with someone who might be pushing themselves too hard right now, someone who thinks rest is weakness, or who believes they'll slow down later. They might need this reminder today more than ever. Subscribe if you want more stories about the real lessons behind success. Not just the victories, but the struggles, the mistakes, and the near misses that make us human. And tell me, have you ever had a moment when you realized your pace, your lifestyle, or your habits were unsustainable? What was the wake-up call that made you stop and rethink everything?